The most important thing I want to say in this whole briefing is there are cupcakes in the back for those of you who stay, okay? And we'll make it actually a treat to be here the whole time. This is a tough subject, but one that we will lighten the burden for. My name is Joan Duffel. I'm Executive Director of Committee for Children, and I'll be moderating this panel today. I want to really thank all of you for coming to hear about this very important topic of child sexual abuse, about the importance of focusing on prevention, not just treatment or incarceration, and the importance of federal funding to build the science of what works in preventing child sexual abuse. I want to thank the sponsors and partners that are here for this briefing. Reliance, Committee for Children, that's the organization that I'm with. The National Children's Alliance, some of you may be familiar with them. National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, Futures Without Violence, and the Johns Hopkins Center, the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse. So thank you to all of those partners today. So I want to tell you briefly about my organization. Very briefly, we are a nonprofit. We're located in Seattle, Washington. We work with almost half of the schools in the United States, focusing on the prevention of child sexual abuse as well as the promotion of children's social and emotional competence. So we have a big reach, but our most important focus is not our reach, it's our focus on impact and research. That is truly what defines our organization. So we have been around for 40 years, and we have a big reach to kids. We're almost 15 million children this year that we're reaching. We reach kids in 70 countries and all 50 states. And again, that reach is not nearly as important as our belief in deepening our impact so that we have real effects, positive effects on children and society. So you're going to hear from our panel today about why you should care about this issue. And very top line, I need you to know this is an issue that is critically important. Child sexual abuse is highly prevalent in our country, more prevalent than most people realize. It spans across socioeconomic, racial boundaries. It is a problem in every community. The consequences are dire for children, for communities, and to the whole country. And you're going to hear more about that. So that's why we should care. There is a lot happening at the state level in policy around child sexual abuse, and this is part of the disconnect. We have a law called Aaron's Law that's focusing on states doing prevention work, but it's a very specific requirement about what prevention is called within that law. And 20 states now mandate that sexual abuse prevention programs be in place in schools in particular. 9 states allow it, and 21 states lack such laws. They've tried, but they haven't quite moved there. But to say that half the states in the country have a law that says you need to be doing something around child sexual abuse prevention, yet we lack a scientific base for what really works in this field is really the disconnect we're going to be talking about today. Aaron's Law really talks about these elements of practice, so training for adults, so grown-ups understand what sexual abuse is and how they might unwittingly put kids in harm's way and what they might do to recognize and report abuse when it's happening. Policies and procedures in schools, research and evidence-based programs for kids, and parent education. So those are kind of the components of that law. But I think, you know, the big clarion call you're going to hear today is about the need for federal funding to focus particularly on prevention. Because child sexual abuse is preventable, we have some promising early data that shows us that we can prevent child sexual abuse if we use the right practices. And some practices have evidence of effectiveness, but we need more research to truly understand what works and what are the mechanisms within those programs that truly are making the difference. So federal funding for this is key, and I want you to imagine for a minute that you're Dr. Jonas Salk in the late 40s and early 50s who has got some promising effects out of a vaccine that has been developed to prevent polio. And you've got a little bit of data. You don't have a lot yet. You've got a couple of clinical trials. You think something good is here. You think maybe, and I'm really speaking out of turn because we've got somebody at the CDC here, but so I'm making this story up. But, sorry. But, you know, imagine that you're in that place and you see this polio epidemic crossing the world, and you have something that works, and there's no money to continue to study it. And so this vaccine gets put on a shelf. And here we are in 2018, and what percentage of our population, how many of our parents, how many of ourselves, how many of our children would have been affected by polio had that happened, had the federal funding not been there to really focus in on what works? And look at the difference that makes today. And I know that's a biomedical example, it's not exactly the same, but I think you get the importance of prevention and why we should really care. So I'm going to introduce our speakers today. We have a great lineup of speakers. Delegate C.T. Wilson, he's a Maryland State delegate, and he's going to kick off our presentation today. Deborah Chosewood, who is with the Georgia Department of Children and Family Services and is doing some really groundbreaking work in prevention in the state of Georgia, really focusing on early prevention and primary universal prevention work across the state. And then we have Dr. Jim Mercy from the Centers for Disease Control. He's the director of the Violence Prevention Unit. And then Dr. Elizabeth Letourneau, who is the director of the Moore Center for Child Sexual Abuse Prevention at Johns Hopkins. So a great lineup of presenters. We promise to keep it lively and quick, and because we really want to leave questions time for you at the end. Okay? So Delegate Wilson, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you guys for having me here today. I just want to say thanks again for being here. I'm a husband, father of 3 beautiful daughters, former chief prosecutor, I'm an attorney, and I'm a member of the People's House, member of the House of Delegates in Maryland. Now, I have a bad reputation in Maryland. It's probably not undeserved. I'm very distant, unfriendly. I'm a contrarian, so I'm not a team player. I'm angry. Call me a pariah. But let me tell you why I'm here today. I'm here today to let you know I was born the oldest of 17 children. By the time I was 4 years old, I had 3 sisters. I had a mom who was a drug addict. We were taken away because of abuse and neglect. I was thrown into a foster care system in Missouri and Illinois, 13 homes, constantly changing, bouncing around with nobody to depend on, and no steady family or friends. But see, that suffering and neglect made me the perfect child for a specific type of individual. And so I was finally told I was lucky that I was going to be adopted. My adopted father, Tom Wilson, was a kindergarten teacher. He was a Cub Scout master. He was a youth minister. And you guessed it, he was a pedophile. So from 9 to 15, my life went from being very difficult to downright hell. So I'd never had a father before, so I didn't really know what the definition of affection was. I started by just peeing in the same bowl or having sleepovers. And it escalated until I really noticed it wasn't right. And at that time, all pretense of affection was gone. It just became a form of punishment. And after the physical abuse, the sex abuse would always follow for the slightest mistake. And until I was 16 years old, day in, day out, for years on end, until I was old enough to leave. So it may be easy to see why I'm angry when I walk the halls with my shoulders up, because I had a tough life. I was taken from my family, from my sisters, no trust. I was let down by the system that I'm now a part of. But see, it's way more than that. The reason I look angry is because I'm fighting to protect our children. It's funny, every 4 years I hear every damn politician say that. Well, then why is it a fight? It should be a discussion. For 22 years in Maryland, we fought to remove the statute of limitations just to allow victims of abuse to confront their abusers in civil court. 22 years. It took me 6 years to get that bill passed, and that was watered down. Last year, we had passed the trash just to protect our students in schools, to say, if you've been disciplined as a teacher for sexual impropriety to a student, that information should be passed to your next employer. It was killed by members of my party. Yeah, it was killed by the committee member in my party, of that subcommittee. My opponents are lawyers, politicians, men of God, my party. And I'm just trying to fight for kids. See, I thought we were the good guys because this isn't that complicated. It's not about gun rights. It's not about reproductive rights or religion. This is about protecting children and preventing child sex abuse. That's why I'm here today, to ask the feds to take their rightful place and lead our country in these preventive measures in the research, because the states aren't going to do it by themselves. It's not just about my horrific childhood, because if you've never been sodomized or abused day in, day out for weeks on end by the one man who said that he loved you enough to adopt you, if you've never been beaten and tortured until you begged to be raped, then I can't probably convey the pain and anguish that I and a lot of other people suffer. No need to give you these gruesome details because there's nothing I can say that can provide any clarity to any of you. But I can tell you one thing, the damages continue to toll. You can't put a child through all that and just think that they're going to grow up and be okay. If you don't know me, I'm hyper violent. I was a combat soldier for years. Quick to temper, quick to violent. Self-medication, drinking, drugs, anything you can get your hands on. I remember those days. I was suicidal, reckless. I felt, if I died in war, at least that my life would mean something because it's worthless otherwise. But worst of all, I was disconnected. See, after enough people turn a blind eye to what you're going through and they pretend it doesn't happen, the person that you trust and love the most is the one that hurts you the worst and destroys your soul. You have to let go of your humanity. And that is very dangerous. Scientifically, it's just called a sociopath. My relationships, I've been through more marriages than I admit. My wife's barely holding on. Very few friends, and I like it that way. I've lost jobs, I've lost ranks. I'm surprised I've been elected this long. I don't sleep. I get cat naps because, see, when I sleep, I can't control myself. I can control myself during the day because I am a warrior, but at night, I'm just a little 7, 8, 9-year-old boy, and it is tough. I had a heart attack when I was 41 years old. 4 months ago, I had blood clots in my lungs because my life is going to be short. Because, see, for me, the demons are right beneath the surface, trying to find a breach in that armor. There's no treatment. Treatment's not the answer. There's no treatment that's going to bring me back to normal. It's not going to undo what's going to be. You can't unring that bell. And I know in my heart, no matter how much I try, that I am not a good person. So I have to watch my reactions and say, well, what would a normal person do in these situations? Every morning I get up, I don't play, I don't joke. I know who I am on the inside. And I know the evil lurks right beneath, and I have to look at myself. Sometimes I say something self-deprecating, usually, ain't never been shit, ain't gonna be shit. I say something, and I splash water on my face, yeah, but it's not my baby's fault, and it's not my wife's fault. Today, we're not gonna let it beat me. Because, see, I know some of y'all look at me, because I know in many ways I am a monster. Some of you might even see me as unfit for office, but there are so many more just like me out there, and many way worse, because it's a cycle of abuse. There are people out there right now confusing that abuse for some form of love and affection, and they're adults. Right now, they're living as sexual predators. NAMBLA is something that is real. I'm not here to talk about how great I am, and I don't need your pity. This is a very embarrassing moment. I know that my life is not measured in years, weeks, or even days, but in breaths. And that each time I give these speeches to try and help somebody, my life shortens. Because the dreams are going to start fresh tonight. I'm going to go into that deep, unreasonable sadness. I close myself off to my friends and family. Each time I jump this deep to talk to you, I worry that I'm never going to be able to climb back out. Good thing to say, I know I'm nobody special. There are millions of people like me. I know that sometimes you don't get to be the great difference maker. You don't get to be the next Martin Luther King or JFK, but you may get to inspire them. So if I can motivate individuals to keep fighting, or just remind some of you, even in the audience, that you're not alone, and not to give up, then it is worth it. And for the very last thing I do on this earth is open up the eyes of our federal government of the true and lasting horrors of child sex abuse and help promote some federal intervention and research, because it can be prevented. If I only do those things before I pass, then it is well with my soul. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Wilson. Powerful words. Thank you. So next we have Deborah Chosewood from the Georgia Department of Children and Family Services.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, if that doesn't speak to the reason we're all here and why we do the work that we do on this side of the table, I think nothing I say is going to make it any clearer. My name is Deborah Chosewood. I am the Deputy Director of the Prevention and Community Support section of Georgia's Division of Family and Children Services, which is our state's child welfare agency. Our office is charged with utilizing federal and state funds to implement primary and secondary prevention efforts, mostly geared at child abuse or child maltreatment prevention, but we also have a couple of teen pregnancy prevention federal grants that are implemented through our agency. A variety of the efforts that we utilize our funding to support are aimed at the prevention of child sexual abuse in particular. So just to give you a little backdrop to why our office has focused on child sexual abuse prevention, we have had in the past year, in 2018, 2,900 children who have been reported to our child welfare agency as being sexually abused. We all know that those numbers are highly underreported. So the 3,000 children who were reported are probably only a drop in the bucket of those who actually lived through the experience that we just heard about. Of those, 728 were substantiated, which means that they were investigated through to the point where our agency determined that the allegations were accurate. That doesn't mean that the balance of those were not substantiated. It just means that it could not be proven at that time. Often those cases will come back, unfortunately, later with another report to our agency. We also fund through our office our state's child advocacy centers, and the child advocacy centers are charged with doing forensic interviews of those reports of child sexual abuse. They will do medical examinations when appropriate. They will provide counseling and therapy for alleged victims, and they will also make referrals out into intervention services. Our child advocacy centers of Georgia just got an increase of almost 200% to their budget from $1.5 million to $2.5 million in 2019, and it was because of the increase of the rate of child sexual abuse in our state. Of those numbers, many of the child sexual abuse allegations end up falling under the category of human trafficking. So either children who were in the system, in the foster care system, like we just heard about, have a higher risk of being trafficked, becoming victims of trafficking, or they are runaways or those who are involved in substance abuse, high school dropouts, et cetera. And so Georgia has one of the highest rates of human trafficking in the country. Because of that, several years ago, the Georgia governor started a statewide human trafficking task force, of which I'm a member. And our task force was divided up into a variety of work groups. The work group that I'm a part of is called Youth Aware and Safe. And so we reviewed curriculum that were implemented to reduce child sexual abuse in general. So human trafficking in particular, but the more general child sexual abuse prevention criteria. So we reviewed about 25 of the known to us at that point programs that were implemented to reduce child sexual abuse. We developed a rubric using the principles of prevention, and those of us on the task force utilized that rubric to score the curricula or the programs. And of those 25, 7 of them rose to the top. And of the 7 that scored well on the principles of prevention, we then went and observed the curriculum being actually implemented in schools or after-school programs, wherever they were being implemented. In 2017, we published the results of that in what we called the Technical Assistance Resource Guide, or TARG, which is kind of a rude name for it, but that's what we call it. And we released that to the public to review what we had put together, which gave a basic explanation for what the problem of child sexual abuse was in our state and the potential solutions for prevention. Currently, we are reviewing additional curricula that we found out about or that were new after we had done our original review of those programs. Then in 2018, as Joan had mentioned earlier, Georgia is one of the newest states to implement an errands-type law. So in July 1st, 2018, the Sexual Abuse and Assault Awareness and Prevention Education Law was passed, and that requires schools from kindergarten through 12th grade to provide annual child sexual abuse prevention awareness to their students, to provide some professional development for teachers and also for school staff, and to require that in-service training be provided to school staff on an annual basis. But that's about as far as the law went. It was just an amendment to a previous law. It was not a standalone law, and there were no requirements. It was an unfunded mandate. And so since the passage of that law, our Georgia Department of Education has brought together a group of us to try to answer the questions of the school systems, which are saying, well, okay, now it's a law. What do we do to actually meet the requirements of the law? And so we have been working with them, but obviously, if we had some federal guidance or some research-based, evidence-based that we could utilize to say, these are the most effective programs, this is what would help the situation the most, that would be very helpful. So from a state perspective, why we would need to have a research and evaluation of the child sexual abuse prevention curricula is that it would allow funders such as our office to be able to consult with what the recommendations were to make sure that wherever we are spending our dollars on prevention of child sexual abuse, that that's an appropriate and effective use of dollars, that we have all learned through personal experience, such as the one we heard about, but also through scientific studies, such as the Adverse Childhood Experiences studies. We've all heard that the impact of child maltreatment, and especially child sexual abuse, doesn't just affect that child. That affects the child welfare system, it affects the school system, it affects the worker productivity, it affects that person's health throughout the remainder of their life. And so the impact, the return on investment, if we do provide funding to support a way to effectively prevent child sexual abuse, the return on investment would be huge. It would also help us to, in the cases of states that don't have a errands type law like Georgia just passed, it would provide a minimum standard for states to have to adhere to if we knew that there were X number of programs or policies that effectively could prevent child sexual abuse. Then that would give states the impetus to be able to meet those minimum standards. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you.
Really great, compelling argument for why we need research. I just want to congratulate our presenters so far. We are right on time. That was just snappy. Thank you so much. So next, we're going to hear from Dr. Jim Mercy of the Centers for Disease Control.
Uh-oh, we're on time, so I guess I'm under pressure here. Thank you. And as Joan said at the outset, thank you for being here. This is a tough subject. And I hope I can add to what our other panelists have said already to help you understand and reinforce what they said about the importance of this, especially as a public health issue. Next slide. I want to start out by having you imagine something. Imagine you woke up this morning and you picked up the newspaper and went online, and the headline said that scientists had discovered a new disease. The article went on to say that each year, about 1 out of 4 girls, or 1 out of 4 boys, 1 out of 10 boys were exposed to this disease. That's millions upon millions of children each year that are exposed to this disease. And also they reported those children exposed to this disease were more likely during their lifetimes to experience mental health problems, infectious diseases such as HIV, and even chronic diseases such as heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. What if we had such a disease? I gotta believe that if we had such a disease, that we would be taking every measure we could to try to invest in the science needed to understand how to prevent it. Now, the truth is we do have such a disease. It's called child sexual abuse. Well, I want to be clear about what we mean when we're saying child sexual abuse. And there's really 4 elements that I want to emphasize in the definition, which you can't see on the screen right now, so I'll try to explain in detail. First, CSA, or child sexual abuse, refers to all forms of sexual violence against children and youth under the age of 18. Second, child sexual abuse occurs when children or youth are forced, induced, or coerced to engage in sexual acts, including fondling, penetration, exposure to other sexual activities, and trafficking. Third important aspect to understand is that these acts can be perpetrated by parents, other adult caregivers, dating partners, acquaintances, or strangers. And it's so important to note that it's been estimated that over 90% of these acts are perpetrated by someone known to the victim. The idea of stranger danger is a part of the problem, but a small part of this issue. And finally, these acts can occur online or in person. As we've already alluded to, child sexual abuse is much too common. Based on data from the National Survey of Children Exposed to Violence, it's estimated about 3.7 million children were exposed to at least one form of child sexual abuse in the U.S. in 2014. That's about 1 out of every 20 children in 1 year. Based on data from a cross-section of surveys, it's been estimated that upon completing childhood at age 18, as many as 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 10 boys will have experienced child sexual abuse at some point in their childhood. In 2016, slightly more than 57,000 children were substantiated to have experienced child sexual abuse by child welfare agencies across the country. I tried to find an estimate of how many cases of child sexual abuse were reported to police, but I couldn't find a really good estimate. But my point here is when you contrast that figure and what may be the number of reported to police against the 3.7 million, it's probably less than 10 or even less than 5% of cases of child sexual abuse that come to the attention of child welfare agencies or police. This is a hidden problem. It's invisible to us in large extent. Another important point about child sexual abuse is that it's costly and destructive. We have decades of evidence now that indicates that child sexual abuse is an adverse experience. You may have heard about child adversity, or adverse childhood experiences. Child sexual abuse is an important one of these. What we're learning over the past few decades suggests that experiences such as child sexual abuse can have lasting damage to the most basic levels of our nervous system, our endocrine system, and our immune system, making people who suffer from this experience more likely to suffer diseases throughout their lifetime. As I alluded to earlier, those exposed to child sexual abuse are more likely to experience mental health problems during their lifetime, infectious diseases, especially HIV and other sexually transmitted infections, chronic diseases, as I said, such as heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. Engage in risky behaviors, such as substance abuse. Exposure to things like child sexual abuse is an important risk factor for opioid overdose. And suicidal behavior, two of the raging epidemics we're experiencing in this country right now. Also, poor school performance. And also, social outcomes, such as unemployment, not graduating from high school, and poverty. We have a vision at CDC for addressing child abuse and neglect, including child sexual abuse. It's about creating safe, stable, and nurturing relationship environments for all children. But in order to realize this vision, we need better science. We need a better understanding of this problem. The way CDC contributes to this issue is in 4 general buckets or areas of work. The first is developing data for research and monitoring. These data are critically important for monitoring the problem, know how large it is for both communities, states, and federally. We've invested over the years in integrating questions into surveys like the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, the Violence Against Children Survey, which we do across the world. We've incorporated questions into these surveys, which give us a better understanding and way to monitor the problem. But there's many gaps in the way we're measuring things in these surveys. We also do research to understand actionable risk and protective factors. We want to understand the factors that we can actually change through programs or policies that can make a difference in reducing this problem and preventing it. For example, we funded research trying to identify risk factors for sexual abuse by adolescent offenders. We've done a lot of investment in research to determine the effectiveness of child sexual abuse prevention strategies. We've done rigorous evaluations of programs such as Safe Dates, Green Dot, which is a bystander program, and Second Step, another school-based program that is found to be effective in reducing sexual violence. And these programs are now part of the evidence base that we can point to for preventing this problem, but they're not enough. We've also used that scientific understanding to influence how we can best disseminate and implement strategies, prevention strategies, and policies across the country that can make a difference. We provide the funding for the Rape Prevention Education Program, which goes to all 50 states, and we use that program to get states to implement evidence-based strategies to prevent sexual violence, both in adults and among children. We also have something called Essentials for Childhood that is designed to give states the same power to address different forms of child maltreatment, including child sexual abuse. Despite this work by CDC and also work by many others in this field, there are critical gaps remain in our understanding of the problem and how to prevent it. We've been asked just this past year by Congress to prepare a congressional report on the gaps in understanding child sexual abuse and where we need to focus research. And what I'm going to share with you now is some of the gaps and needs that we've identified as part of the process in putting that report together. The first is about needs and opportunities in that first bucket, data for research and monitoring. And these are just examples. There's many more than I'm sharing with you here. I'm just trying to illustrate some of the gaps. One is because of the lack of strong data, we lack a system that states and communities can use to monitor the problem. If you want to get somewhere else, if I want to get to the Washington Monument, I need to know where I am. The same's true with problems like this. We need data to identify and help us understand where we are so we can map out a strategy for where we want to go, and we can monitor it over time. This is really important underpinning for prevention. And that type of system still needs to be developed and implemented. We also lack data on the prevalence of adult sexual interest in and behavior with children. This is a very important gap in our data. How can we incorporate questions that get at this issue into surveys and other methodologies so we can get a better understanding of the prevalence and nature of this part of the problem? We lack data on specific forms of child sexual abuse, like sexual trafficking. There's very soft data on the size of that problem. We really have a very poor understanding. Another area of need is in the research on identifying actionable risk and protective factors. We need to strengthen our understanding of factors contributing to the perpetration of different forms of child sexual abuse. Perpetration is important to understand. We have a lot of programs that focus on protecting children from being a potential victim. But if we're going to really make population-based impact in reducing child sexual abuse, we need to reduce the supply of perpetrators. And so we need much more understanding of what it is that gives rise to perpetration so that we can better design programs to intervene and prevent children from, or boys and girls from becoming perpetrators. We need to give greater attention to understanding what protects against child sexual abuse. We do a lot of research in public health on risk factors. We always talk about risk factors. But perhaps more centrally important to prevention is understanding what protects people from becoming perpetrators. What is it in families and communities in society that can offer a protective environment for children that prevents them from developing these behaviors? And finally, we need a better understanding of the community and societal risk factors that contribute to child sexual abuse. We understand much more about individual factors and factors in families than we do about how broad social norms, broad social factors, how community structures influence child sexual abuse, how norms around and beliefs around male sexual entitlement, for example, contribute, and how can we influence that. Next is to identify effective prevention strategies, perhaps the most important area. Again, some key issues are developing and rigorously evaluating perpetration-focused prevention strategies for the same reasons I alluded to earlier. We need to prevent people from growing into perpetrators, from developing into perpetrators. Understanding how to alter norms and beliefs that contribute to child sexual abuse. Again, critically important. Our society holds certain beliefs and norms that contribute to this problem. Evaluation of public policies that may contribute to child sexual abuse prevention. We also need to understand, of course, better about how to programs that intervene, but also public policies. Delegate Wilson, as a legislature, needs to understand what the evidence is for the policies he's going to advocate for and to argue for in the legislature. We need to provide him and others like him with the evidence to support what they are going to advocate for and implement. Finally is the area of dissemination and implementation. Again, all that science contributes to what we can do and how we can effectively disseminate and implement the evidence base to make a difference. So there's many areas of critical need for research in this area, in child sexual abuse. And that research is critical for us really making a difference, making progress and making a difference to reduce this problem. I'll just end with my favorite quote by Jack Shonkoff. And he said that one of the most powerful ways to change the world is to make it a better place for kids. And I would just add to that one of the most powerful ways to make the world a better place for kids is to reduce their exposure, to prevent their exposure to child sexual abuse. And we need the science to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Great practical advice about how we can move forward. And finally, bringing this to a close will be Dr. Elizabeth Letourneau, who is at Johns Hopkins University, the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse. Thank you.
I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank my fellow panelists for their expertise. When we were putting this together, when Joan was putting the briefing together, we talked about who should go first, second, third, last, and I made an argument for Delegate Wilson to go first and for me to go last, and I don't remember what I based it on, but the reality is I've gone after him before, and I can't do it without crying. And I'm not interested in having you people watch me cry. So I put a little distance between myself and his powerful comments. As Joan said, my name's Elizabeth Letourneau. I direct the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse, and I'm a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. For 30 years, I've worked toward the eradication of child sexual abuse. I know that everyone in this room supports a childhood free from sexual abuse. This is not a partisan issue. This is not a divisive issue. We all agree. No child should have to experience what Delegate Wilson went through. No child should have to experience sexual abuse of any kind. We all know that sexual abuse is harmful. And because we know this, we take it seriously. Our country has implemented the most extensive criminal justice responses to child sexual abuse anywhere in the world. That's not hyperbole. I want to take a moment to describe our federal response to child sexual abuse. Relative to all other federal defendants, defendants convicted of a sexual offense are most likely to receive a prison sentence. Nearly all of them do. And they serve the longest average prison sentences. In fact, in federal courts, the average prison sentence for a sexual offense exceeds the average prison sentence for a murder conviction. Today, there are more than 16,000 adults in federal prisons for sexual offenses. It costs $32,000 per person per year to house someone in a federal prison. This means that annually, we spend $512 million incarcerating sex offenders in federal facilities. $512 million. There are 10 times that number of sex offenders in state facilities, but I'm going to focus on the federal dollars. This is just on incarceration. This does not include costs to investigate crimes, to prosecute crimes, does not include pretrial detention or post-release parole. As I said, the US takes this seriously. We put enormous resources into these and other after-the-fact criminal justice sanctions, and these are important, but that money doesn't make much difference to victims. How much money do we spend at the federal level to prevent child sexual abuse? I can tell you the answer is precious little. There's no single source of federal funding that is specific to the prevention of child sexual abuse. Designating massive resources after sexual abuse has already occurred, and almost no resources to prevent abuse is a choice. Children are harmed by this choice. We are all harmed by this choice. So why do we do this? Why do we put nearly all of our money, time, and effort into punishment and so little into prevention? I believe that we focus so much energy on after-the-fact responses because most people, and perhaps many of you, really don't believe that child sexual abuse can be prevented. Instead, we believe that people who sexually abuse children are unpredictable, unpreventable monsters, and that the best thing we can do, the only thing we can do, is to wait for them to strike and to lock them up for as long as possible afterwards. Criminal justice sanctions are an important component of a national approach to child sexual abuse, but these sanctions kick in only after a child has been harmed. We can do better than this, and I think we must. To build a comprehensive approach to child sexual abuse, an approach that includes effective prevention efforts requires resources. Elected officials have told me that they agree it would be better to prevent child sexual abuse, that no child should have to experience child sexual abuse. They understand that prevention is probably more cost-effective than after-the-fact intervention, but they just don't have the money to invest in prevention. Yet they have $512 million to invest in incarcerating offenders. A question I often get is, what does effective prevention look like? Individuals and organizations have come up with their own answers to this question over the years, and I'm going to give you some examples. More than 30 years ago, youth-serving organizations, including Big Brothers Big Sisters of America and the Boy Scouts of America, examined their internal records of child sexual abuse cases to identify signs of abuse, things like Scoutmaster giving kids piggyback rides or massages or alcohol. And they implemented rules that forbade these behaviors to limit the circumstances in which adult-child contact might instigate sexual feelings. 20 years ago, the Boys and Girls Clubs of America started working with an architect to design buildings that were safer for children. For example, they placed windows in all their interior doors to make adult-child interactions more observable and more interruptible. And just 2 years ago, the YMCA began experimenting with simple signs that are designed to remind staff and volunteers about key concepts from the Y's mandatory child sexual abuse prevention training. They want to see if it's possible to nudge people toward good behavior and away from bad behavior. So for 30 years, youth-serving organizations and schools and religious groups and sports clubs and parents have been developing and implementing their own prevention efforts. And almost none of it has been tested. In the absence of evaluation, any given prevention effort might work, might not work, or it might actually make things worse, which we've actually discovered in some of the research we've done. In the absence of research, there's simply no way to tell. It takes federal resources to build a comprehensive approach to child sexual abuse that includes effective prevention efforts. That is why we are asking for $10 million in new federal funding to go to the CDC to support the thoughtful development and rigorous evaluation of child sexual abuse prevention programming. It's easy to say that we don't have the money if we don't believe prevention works. 30 years ago, we began taking a prevention approach to every other type of childhood injury and illness. This includes child physical abuse, child neglect, bullying, peer-on-peer violence, and adolescent suicide. Yet because we choose to believe that child sexual abuse alone, among all types of childhood victimization, is somehow not preventable, is somehow uniquely not preventable, we do not invest in its prevention. Child sexual abuse is preventable, not inevitable. We ask you to use your extraordinary power as advisors to newly elected senators to convince your colleagues that child sexual abuse is a preventable public health problem, and to ensure that we invest not only in prosecution and punishment, but also in prevention. Again, we spend $512 million each year just to lock offenders up in federal facilities. We are asking for $10 million in new funding each year to support the the CDC's efforts to advance the prevention of child sexual abuse, we're not asking for parity, not even close. We're asking for an investment in prevention that amounts to less than 2% of what we already spend on incarceration. We hope that you will support this request. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Such a good, clear ask. I love that. So does everybody get their marching orders, call to action, $10 million to the CDC in upcoming appropriations, correct? All right. And there is a report coming out. There was report language developed to request a report from the CDC about this, and that is forthcoming. So tell your members that that's on its way, okay? I'm ready to take questions from anybody. We've got a few more minutes for questions. I'll kick one off with Dr. Letourneau. I'd love to hear a description of one of the, to get even more literal about effective prevention practice, something that your shop has developed that is showing promise.
Sure, and I'm just going to do a mic check. Can you guys hear okay? Thanks. Thanks for that. So at the Moore Center, we are developing several primary prevention interventions. That means interventions that seek to prevent harm from occurring in the first place. And we are focusing on individuals who might engage in harmful behavior. It will probably surprise you to learn that about half of sexual offenses against very young children, prepubescent children, children 12 and under, about half of sexual offenses against prepubescent children are committed by other children under the age of 18 and usually under the age of 15. We believe, and actually we know from some of our research, that this is because as kids become sexual, they don't know the rules of the road. They don't understand that they are not to involve younger children in sexual experimentation or sexual play. So we have developed a school-based prevention program that targets 6th and 7th grade children who are right around the cusp of puberty and beginning these behaviors. And the curricula is very clear. It's designed to increase empathy for younger children, to explain developmental differences between younger and older children, and to explain in very clear language, using the right language for body parts, why we don't involve younger children in sexual behavior as we become sexual. This intervention is called Responsible Behavior with Younger Children. We're partnering with Baltimore City Schools, and we have just launched a randomized controlled trial that will be the first test of this intervention. These kids are not, let me hasten to say, any different than you or I were in 6th and 7th grade. These are kids, and they need clear messaging, and we need to recognize it's our responsibility as adults to give that. Responsible Behavior with Younger Children seeks to do that, and we also have interactions with parents built into the intervention so that the parents get this information, can reinforce it at home, not only with the child that's in 6th or 7th grade, but with their other children as well.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I think it really helps to just get a very tangible idea of what a prevention practice might look like on the ground. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, about the money that was spent on incarceration and everything like that. I was wondering if you could give us any guidance with our advocacy efforts on what would be the return on investment on prevention efforts. So the ROI, or the return on investment. So we spend a lot on the back end, as Dr. Letourneau said. And so the suggestion that to spend a little bit by comparison on prevention, what would the return on investment be for communities? You want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take a crack at that. We published a cost study that looked, and actually this was in collaboration with Dr. Mercy and other colleagues of ours who are health economists. We published a cost study that estimated the economic burden of child sexual abuse to the United States as a nation. That burden exceeds $9.2 billion. An individual victim, a person who suffers child sexual abuse, will lose on average about $283,000 in comparison to his or her non-abused peers over the course of his or her life. So when we think about prevention, you do want to look at both what we might call clinical effectiveness as well as cost effectiveness. We do not yet have cost effectiveness data because we have so few validated prevention programs because we've had no dedicated sources of funding for developing and testing prevention programs. However, in other areas where we look at prevention in comparison to incarceration or to other kind of post-abuse interventions, when we have effective programs that reduce the likelihood of harm occurring, I can only think of examples where we see strong cost benefit, where we see that for every dollar you put into an effective prevention program, you're saving often many other dollars that would ordinarily go into incarceration and everything else that goes along with incarceration.
Thank you. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that. Okay. All right. There was a question way in the back, and then I'll get you.
So I'm wondering a little bit more about the $10 million a year for appropriation. How long would you guys want that money authorized for? And then do you have like a rough outline? I know you guys maybe mentioned some sort of report that's coming out, like a rough outline of whether that money might be going towards grants for states, or how you guys see that being utilized.
Okay, so the question is for the $10 million that we are asking to be appropriated to the CDC for prevention science development. Is that an annual ask? Is that something that, how long are we expecting to need that? And then the other part of the question was, what was it again? Sorry. Oh, yes. How would you allocate it? Would it be competitive grants, et cetera? So I am not sure exactly. I don't know if our folks here on the Hill can help us with that. Yeah. Can try talking to a microphone, please, so that we can get you on the video. We are videotaping this, and if you've signed up, we can get a link back out to you. Yeah, you can just stand here. Yeah, perfect.
Didn't know this was going to
Yes,
happen
there you
today. Hello. So, hi, I'm Christy Schwartz, also with the CDC, and it's a really complicated question and something that we are definitely working towards. As Dr. Mercy mentioned, we are working on a report right now that would look at what the gaps in research are in this area. So that would likely chart our course for any future kind of appropriations. It's something that we would definitely look at and consider where the need is at the time that an appropriation might come through. So it's something that is a little bit open for discussion, a little bit open for thinking, and a little bit open for what we'll see as a research agenda with the report that's coming out. I don't remember who asked the question.
Yeah, and the first part of the question was just for how long? Don't we want this to be appropriated forever and maybe larger?
Forever and ever. That too depends on, again, some of the findings that we have in terms of what research is needed. Oftentimes our hope at CDC is that our research programs tend to progress and are flexible enough to move with the direction that the research takes as our programmatic work moves forward. So again, it's something that we can talk about a little bit more if you'd like. I'd be happy to give you my card, but it's something that kind of changes as time progresses.
Before you go, I think it would be helpful just to tell you the last time the CDC did something was 2007, and that this other topics have annual reports. Our community is working on data that's more than 10 years old, which was founded on data that was very old. Already old. So. Yeah.
I'm going to let you talk about that part.
Yes, I mean, this whole area needs to be updated and re-energized in terms of improving the data and our understanding, for sure. It's important.
Yeah, and I was being a little facetious about forever because really we just want to eradicate the problem. And then, no more money will be needed for prevention research. Yes.
Yeah, this question, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit to hear a little more about. There's been some analysis or research in terms of sibling abuse, sexual abuse, sometimes by a sibling who maybe was victimized themselves. So how do you, to how great extent is that? How do you deal with that perpetrator and then the victim? How do you prevent that cycle?
So he was asking a question about how common sibling abuse is, particularly I think when you're talking about the children, the statistics about kids abusing other kids. How often is it siblings? And do we have any science around what's effective in dealing with that?
For the perpetrator and the
And yeah, for both sides. Yeah, and I don't know, since you're a clinician, Elizabeth.
Yeah, and so, you know, we have some information on the characteristics of cases that involve children engaging in harmful sexual behavior with other children. And I couldn't cite to you the percent of those cases that involve siblings. It's more often the case that it does not involve a sibling. But the reality is that kids engage in these behaviors for a lot of reasons. Typically, they are what our colleague David Finkelhor has called crimes of convenience. So these would be children who, you know, again, by virtue of developmental or lack of development, tend to be relative to adults more impulsive, less knowledgeable. But as they're becoming teenagers, we give them more and more leeway, so they have less, sometimes inadequate adult supervision. And in that context, we see that kids, relative to adults who engage in who engage in sexual offenses against children, kids more often do this when there is this context of convenience, in the context of babysitting, whether it's someone in their family or not, in the context of providing some form of supervision for younger kids. So what we know, we have very good evidence that treatment works for kids who have engaged in these behaviors. There's been 3 randomized controlled trials that show that treatment is effective. There's another intervention that is coming out with some excellent data. Kids are very unlikely to re-engage in these behaviors once they've been treated. So that's excellent. The fact that recidivism is so very low among youth who have engaged in harmful sexual behaviors, it's actually less than 3% of youth will go on to do this again once they've been identified. So that means 97% won't. That tells me that we probably could have prevented that first offense from happening in the first place. This is not something that is a trait. It's not endemic to the rest of their lives. This is something that we probably could have prevented in the first place, since it almost never reoccurs.
Yes, okay. Go ahead, Delegate Wilson.
Thank you. I just want to chime in also because in talking with a good doctor, I do work as a criminal attorney as well, and one of the mistakes that we are making right now in most states and most jurisdictions, we're labeling them automatically as predators. And many of them are convicted, even if it wasn't, especially in the sibling area, they're convicted and labeled as sex offenders. And as a doctor would say, that's the opposite effect of what we want. And right now, because we don't have proper research, and again, it's not from a federal level, so depending on the area you live in, you might have different beliefs and set of circumstances, which is, again, why we need this money. We need it to originate at the federal level, because we're treating a lot of kids, and I don't want to dismiss it as curious, but there is that impulsiveness and there's that youthful impetuousness, and they're now labeled, some of them, as sex offenders until the age of 21, which was never the intent of the legislator or anybody, I believe, in this room. But because we don't have proper research on prevention aspects or even better treatment aspects for juveniles, we're left to just criminalize them, which I think exacerbates the problem.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, all right.
Will it extend to those situations that children like Delegate Wilson were placed into in terms of vetting of children, of adults that choose to care children are entrusted?
So the question is looking at the situation that Delegate Wilson described in his childhood, being placed in foster care. That was a situation that maybe was preventable had that parent been vetted before you were placed into care, and is some of the prevention work focused on that kind of thing, like really stopping the problem from happening in the first place by looking at adult and vetting people more carefully.
And not just the adult, because that's important, but what's even more important is educating the children. Because again, a lot of you have parents, so there's somebody at some point in your life that tells you nobody but your doctor and me should look at you when you're naked. But nobody tells them that in the foster care system. There is no set of standards. When you have these very ripe victims looking for love, there's no instruction because nobody really values them. Y'all don't think about them unless I bring them up. The wards of our state, they're like our children. And because they're looking for love, a lot of times there's nobody that's instilled this value in them that this is my body. And so part of it's not just vetting individuals, because believe whatever vetting system there is, there's a way around it. But empowering our children as we do our women to make sure that they know how special they are, even if they don't have any parents. And that's, again, not so much in Dr. Letourneau's wheel, but that's in what we do DSS, and we haven't been doing that well.
Okay, yes, Jim.
One aspect of this that we have been working on, and Elizabeth mentioned it in her remarks, is, for example, youth-serving organizations and the strategies they take to protect kids that are served by those organizations, and guidelines that can help them in hiring practices and vetting and other policies that can help protect children under their care. Unfortunately, these haven't been evaluated. And so I think very much so we'd like to look at those types of practices. And I know the Moore Center is doing some of that work right now and see what is most helpful and effective.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. And you're all been so good. I hope we have enough cupcakes. Yes. Back here somewhere? Yes.
Can you give a little bit of insight into how you're going to do the evaluations of the programs? Are you choosing programs, or are you developing your own programs and things that you've used before? How is that?
So the question is if the CDC receives these funds, will it start with development of new programs or do evaluation of existing programs? Do you have a sense of what that might look like, Jim?
I think it will be a combination. Other areas of violence prevention, that's what we've done. We've done a little bit of developing our own programs or supported others to do that and then evaluate them. We've also invested in evaluating interventions that are in existence and operating, as well as policies. So it's a combination. It depends. Once we get done with this review, we'll have a better sense of how we would balance that.
Mm-hmm. And kind of where the gaps are, I would expect too, right? Yes, sir. Yeah.
And I apologize. I thought the doctor was going to speak up, but I guess not. I'll say that the most important thing that we'll hope to get out of this personally is what the doctor said earlier, is that nobody knows it's preventable. I don't think anybody's starting from that position. Most states, most jurisdictions are not starting. So if we get the CDC involved and they start evaluating these programs, I really believe we can turn a corner here, because I didn't know until I met Dr. Letourneau that it was preventable. Most people don't. And she gave me great hope. That's why I'm here today. And I think she will give a lot of others great hope. I think the CDC can, if this become the new message of it being preventable, because stranger danger doesn't work. We need to do better. And the CDC, the leading research center for our country, needs to be leading the way. I think once they get that message out there, I think that's what was going to turn the corner. And then you're going to have more of these other agencies stepping up to the plate. Because right now, nobody thinks it can be prevented. They just wait for it to happen. And then you're dealing with somebody like me for the rest of your life. So if you're my constituent, I apologize in advance.
Oh, geez. Sorry, that's my phone. So yes, Jim.
I just want to emphasize one thing, going back a little earlier in the conversation, and because I think it's so important that preventing child sexual abuse is strategic from a public health standpoint because of the downstream effects on all sorts of different health and social outcomes. So it's sort of one-stop shopping from a policymaker standpoint. Where can you invest your money and have such a broad impact? So please remember that as you think about this, that this is not, that the potential benefits, which we can't fully measure actually yet, the costs are potentially huge.
What a great couple of notes to end on. Thank you so much for sort of bringing that all home for us. And thanks to all of you for taking time out. I know everybody's got the impending snow on their minds. You're thinking about schools getting out early and am I going to get home in time? So thank you so much for staying the entire time. And really, I hope you will take this back and bring this to your members as a really high priority topic to consider. And there are cupcakes and coffee in the back, so please mingle if you can. Thank you. Thanks to our panelists. Great panelists. Thank you.